We all know mass timber is the future of low-carbon building, but what happens when you bring it to Vietnam? You're facing a really unique set of challenges. We're talking everything from intense tropical humidity to a pretty complex legal system. So how do you actually build with timber here without falling into a regulatory or even an environmental trap? Let's break down the blue part.
Okay, before we even think about a piece of timber, we have to talk about the law. Because in Vietnam, there's a huge difference between following the code and falling into a super costly trap. And let me tell you, confusing these two isn't just a paperwork error. It can stop your project dead in its tracks. This is the first and honestly the most critical thing you have to master.
So, let's dive in and break down the rules of the game. It all starts with these two key acronyms. They form the legal backbone for every single nail, beam, and foundation in Vietnam.
The distinction is actually pretty simple, but it is so crucial. On your left, you've got QCVN. Those are the National Technical Regulations. Think of this as the law. It's totally non-negotiable. And on the right, you have TCVN. These are the national standards. This is the method. It's the accepted way to prove you've actually followed the law.
And let's be absolutely crystal clear on this. QCVN regulations are 100% mandatory. They are not guidelines, they're not suggestions. If a QCVN specifies a requirement for, say, fire safety or structural loads, that is the law, period. There's no way to opt out.
And this brings us to probably the single biggest trap for international teams. There's this really dangerous assumption that you can just bring in your global best practice or a standard from your home country and that's good enough. It's not. Your international experience, no matter how great, does not override a mandatory QCVN regulation. So, what that really means is you can't just copy-paste a design that worked perfectly in Sydney or Tokyo and expect it to be compliant in Ho Chi Minh City. Let's take a look at where some of the international standards line up and where they completely fall apart.
First up, some good news. When it comes to designing for earthquakes, things are actually pretty straightforward. Vietnam's national standard is basically a direct translation of Eurocode 8. So if your team is familiar with European seismic engineering, you are on solid ground here.
But then, there's wind. The new 2023 standard requires a massive 2.1 safety factor. This is a huge trap. If you try to apply American or Australian wind load calculations here, your building will be dangerously underdesigned and completely non-compliant. It's a critical and potentially very costly difference.
Okay, so what happens when there's a gap in the code? Let's take an innovative material like cross-laminated timber. You know, where layers of wood are glued together to make these super strong panels. Well, Vietnam doesn't have its own manufacturing standard for that yet. So this means you have to use what's called a reference standard strategy. You have to formally adopt an international standard like ISO 16696 just to get your materials approved by the ministry.
Okay, we've navigated the legal code. Now we have to face the laws of nature. You know, most mass timber manuals, they're written for cold, dry climates. Vietnam is the opposite. It is a hot, humid, biological powerhouse, and it will test your building in ways you might not be expecting.
This next concept, it changes everything. In a place like Europe, timber tends to dry out and actually get stronger. But here, in the constant high humidity, it absorbs moisture right out of the air. You literally have to treat the weight of that absorbed water as a permanent load that's always acting on your structure.
And here's what that looks like in numbers. The local code forces you to take a Service Class B penalty. That means you have to reduce the calculated strength of your timber by 15%. You do that by applying this 0.85 factor. If you miss this step, your beams could start to sag over time.
Now for the second tropical challenge, termites. And we are not talking about just any termites. The local Coptotermus species are famous for being incredibly aggressive, and they require a very specific defense strategy.
Now, this is a critical point that corrects a really common international misconception. While physical mesh barriers are part of the system, they are absolutely not considered enough on their own for structural protection here in Vietnam. If you rely on mesh alone, your building will be vulnerable and non-compliant.
So what do? You have to use a multi-layered chemical defense. The law requires that all your structural softwoods get treated with an H3 equivalent preservative. That's a chemical treatment made for exterior, above-ground use. Then, that has to be combined with chemically treated soil barriers. And finally, the physical mesh. It's a whole system, and it's mandatory.
All right, let's move to the final hurdle. And trust me, it's a big one. Fire safety. Vietnam's fire code, QCVN-06, is one of the strictest in the whole region, and it definitely wasn't written with modern mass timber in mind.
You basically have two choices. The prescriptive path is simple. You follow the rules in the book exactly as written. The catch? Those rules don't allow for any exposed timber. So if you want to show off the beauty of the wood, you have to take the performance path. And that means you have to prove with very specific engineering data that your design is just as safe.
Successfully navigating that performance path, it requires a really clear strategy. You're going to need internationally recognized fire test data, something like from an ISO 83 test, to prove your timber's char rate. Then you can use TCVN-compliant sprinkler systems as a kind of trade-off in your negotiations with the fire police to get your exposed timber design approved.
So we've covered this complex web of regulations, environmental loads, fire safety negotiations. It's a lot, right? The question is, how do you manage all of this? Well, this is where the blueprint comes together.
The SAWA Technical Guide is designed to be your single source of truth for all of this. It gives you that clear path through the QVN versus TCVN maze. It provides the correct local factors for wind and humidity. It specifies that mandatory termite defense we talked about. And it walks you step by step through the fire performance solution.
Ultimately, this is what the guide is all about. It's the missing link. It translates all that amazing global theory of sustainable mass timber into the practical reality of local Vietnamese law and conditions. It lets you specify timber with confidence.
You know, this isn't just about one project, it's about building the technical foundation for an entire industry. By joining SAWA, you get this guide, and you also help fund the critical research we need to keep pushing sustainable construction forward. So the final question is, are you ready to help build the future of Vietnam?